Even though most medications used in psychiatry are derived directly from plant secondary metabolites or patented variations of them by pharmaceutical companies, only very recently have psychiatrists in the Western world begun to consider the healing power of plants. Shown here is the cover of the March 2010 issue of the so-called Green Journal of the American Psychiatric Association, the most prestigious and conservative journal in American psychiatry that for the first time featured dietary considerations as related to psychiatric disorders. An editorial appeared in that issue written by Marlene Freeman, medical doctor, psychiatrist, and associate professor of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, titled Nutrition and Psychiatry, in which she made encouraging statements about a shift that psychiatry might take in the prevention or treatment of mental disorders, such as it is both compelling and daunting to consider that dietary intervention at an individual or population level could reduce rates of psychiatric disorders. One study in that issue, titled Association of Western and Traditional Diets with Depression and Anxiety in Women, showed research into the relationship between diet quality and emotional stress. There is always the challenge, however, of defining objectively diet quality and mood, there being no acceptable gold standard measure of either one. With that in mind, this was a study of about 1,000 adult women examined over a snapshot in time, so-called cross-sectional study. Their conclusion was that a traditional dietary pattern characterized by vegetables, fruit, meat, fish, and whole grains was associated with lower odds for major depression or dysthymia and for anxiety disorders. A Western diet of processed or fried foods, refined grains, sugary products, and beer was associated with a higher GHQ-12 score. The GHQ-12 is just one of those measures of emotional distress, a 12-item questionnaire asked of each subject participant. The lower the score, the better. More generally, the authors state that there was an inverse association between diet quality and the GHQ-12 score. Again, diet quality was defined by a particular food frequency questionnaire utilized. So by their definition, a better diet quality resulted in better emotional states. By their measure, a Western diet is of low diet quality and traditional diet is of higher diet quality. Their results can be seen graphically in this figure. On the left axis is a measure of mood disorder, which of course is better the lower the value, and the bottom axis is related to diet quality, divided into 5 sections or quintiles. The higher the quintile, the better the diet. Generally, the figures do suggest good food, good mood. The gains are particularly significant at the lower quintile associated with the Western diet. Another study published a year earlier in the British Journal of Psychiatry, titled Dietary Pattern and Depressive Symptoms in Middle Age, looked at the junk food-junk mood relationship in adults. This work followed more than 3,000 participants over a 5-year interval whose dietary habits fell into 2 categories: whole food, heavily loaded by vegetables, fruits, and fish, and processed food, heavily loaded by sweetened desserts, fried food, processed meat, refined grains, and high-fat dairy products. At the end of the 5 years, depressive symptomatology was measured by a selected instrument. Their conclusion was that in middle-aged participants, a processed food dietary pattern is a risk factor for depression 5 years later, whereas a whole food pattern is protective. This effect is rather pronounced, as shown in this table. First, just focusing on the whole food dietary pattern and choosing Model 1, which controls for different covariances than the other models, but it's comparable to the other models. The odds ratio related to the likelihood of becoming depressed is considerably better when this dietary pattern is adhered to well, a protective factor for depression. On the other hand, when the processed food dietary pattern is followed extensively, the odds of becoming depressed are significantly increased, a risk factor for depression. Within the limitations of the study, these results are statistically significant and rather dramatic. Another large and recent prospective cohort study performed at the University College London showed a significant correlation between a healthy diet and the lack of depressive symptoms in women over a 5-year interval. A healthy diet was based on the Harvard Alternative Healthy Eating Index, which emphasizes vegetables and fruit, low fat and oils, protein from sources such as fish, nuts, and seeds. It does, however, allow for inclusion of meat and dairy, but less so than current USDA recommendations. Depressive symptoms were based on the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale. Their conclusion that in the current study, there was a suggestion that poor diet is a risk factor for future depression in women. There was a positive dose response nature as well. That is, the healthier the diet, the less the odds of developing sustained depressive symptoms over the 5-year interval. This is indicated here as the OR, or odds ratio, related to the likelihood for depressive symptoms, with 3 levels of healthy eating, or tertiles. As can be seen, the relative risks are lower the healthier the diet. There are a number of other studies that make similar claims of improving mood in adults with better dietary patterns, such as this study at the University of Delaware reported in 2010, which concludes diet quality was significantly associated with reported symptoms of depression. And this one at the University of Calgary in 2012, stating that in their study, was consistent with prior epidemiologic surveys revealing an association between higher levels of nutrient intakes and better mental health. One particularly well-studied dietary pattern, considered by some to be a healthy diet, is the Mediterranean diet. This diet was inspired by the traditional dietary patterns of Greece, Spain, and southern Italy. These countries are the biggest olive-producing countries, so it's no wonder that the diet features olive oil. The principal aspects of this diet include proportionally high consumption of olive oil, together with legumes, unrefined cereals, fruits, and vegetables, moderate to high consumption of fish, moderate consumption of dairy products, moderate wine consumption, and relatively low consumption of meat and meat products. This diet has been chosen for a number of psychiatric studies because the lifetime prevalence of mental disorders has found to be lower in the Mediterranean countries than in the northern European countries. Suicide rates, which may indirectly reflect the prevalence of severe depression, tend also to be lowest in the Mediterranean countries. One such study of the Mediterranean diet, published in 2009 by a group at a Spanish university, examined over 10,000 participants using a physician's clinical diagnosis of mood disorder and the extent of adherence to the Mediterranean diet over an average time interval of more than 4 years. They conclude that their results suggest a potential protective role of the Mediterranean diet with regard to the prevention of depressive disorders. Another large prospective cohort epidemiologic investigation was reported recently from researchers at Loma Linda University. Their conclusion was that foods typical of Mediterranean diets were associated with positive affect as well as lower negative affect, while Western foods were associated with low positive affect and in general and negative affect in women. Positive and negative affect can be thought of as mood scores on a mood scale from 0 to 10, where scores towards 0 are more negative and those toward 10 are more positive. All the dietary studies I've shown so far in the context of exploring mood states define healthy dietary patterns in various ways, but allow for various amounts of most all foods, including meat, fish, and dairy. What about more restrictive diets, such as a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet? There are really few studies in this area. Here's one report, however, on vegetarian diets and mood, but the motivation for doing it was the thought that perhaps vegetarian diets might actually be bad for brain function and mood states because they exclude fish, the major dietary source of omega-3 fatty acids. The investigators used a food frequency questionnaire and a psychometric test called the Depression Anxiety Stress Scale, or DASS, in a cross-sectional study. The conclusion was that the vegetarian diet profile does not appear to adversely affect mood despite low intake of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. I'll present a video later that explores in some depth the issue of consumption of omega-3 fatty acids and brain function. Spoiler alert, current research does not support the need to consume fish or take fish oil supplements for cognitive, behavioral, or emotional health. But the conclusion doesn't tell the whole story. Here are the raw results. Not only does the vegetarian diet not compromise mood states, it results in a considerable advantage over an omnivore diet for both male and females. The same researchers more recently reported a similar study, but in this one, patients were randomly selected to receive 3 different diets over a 2-week time interval. Typical omnivore diet, omnivore with only fish as the flesh food diet, and the vegetarian diet. Mood scores were unchanged for omnivores or omnivore with fish-only participants, but several mood scores for vegetarians improved significantly after only 2 weeks. Their conclusion was that restricting meat and fish and poultry improves some domains of short-term mood states in modern omnivores. And they mentioned correctly that at the time this was the first trial to examine the impact of restricting meat, fish, and poultry, and it's still the only study to date. But their study was of short duration and involving a small number of participants. Though they have some more interesting results that I show here, the effect on anxiety. The red columns in the back are anxiety measures at the beginning of the study. The larger the column, the more anxiety for the 3 diets. The blue columns are after only 2 weeks on the various diets. The randomly selected individuals who ate the vegetarian diet happened to score the highest in anxiety level at the beginning of the study, but scored the lowest compared to those on the other diets after 2 weeks. The same was true as a measure of fatigue. The group with the vegetarian diet was worse at the beginning and best at the end of the study. So my own conclusion is that although we are at a very early stage in our understanding of dietary effects on adult emotional and behavioral health, there does appear to be a significant effect. Please check out my videos on the dietary effects on cognitive, emotional, and behavioral disorders in children, adolescents, and geriatric populations.